Immanuel Kant is known as the last early modern philosopher and the first 19th century philosopher. In this lecture video, I will briefly explain why, looking at a basic overview of Kant's critique of pure reason. Kant was born in 1724 in Königsberg, Germany, and died in 1804 in Königsberg, Germany. He was a somewhat obscure philosopher prior to his publishing of the Critique of Pure Reason in 1781. He mainly wrote on speculative metaphysics, and it wasn't until he actually read Hume and Hume's empiricism that, according to Kant, this woke him out of his dogmatic slumber. From there, he kind of stopped publishing for almost a decade, and then in 1781 publishes the Critique of Pure Reason, this transformative work that begins to actually say, no, what our focus is in epistemology shouldn't so much be how we have knowledge of objects external to the mind, but actually the emphasis becomes on the mind itself, a kind of almost a really prioritizing philosophy of mind in a way, and transcendental philosophy, the conditions for the possibility of knowledge. And so in this way, he kind of criticizes and transforms the project of the early modern period, this debate between empiricism and rationalism. And part of that's why he's the last early modern philosopher, but also the first 19th century philosopher, in the sense that he lives right into just the beginning of the 19th century, but also because the topics that kind of consume the 19th century, influenced by Kant, are that about philosophy of mind and transcendentalism. You get this, for example, in the early German idealists, whether, of course, it be someone like Hegel or Schelling or Fichte. And then, of course, you get later on, because of Kant, in the early 20th century, this movement of phenomenology with Edmund Husserl, Martin Heidegger, Maurice Merleau-Ponty, and so on, all influenced by Kant. So we have these three main works. He calls them the critiques. The first critique is the Critique of Pure Reason, and then when he thought people misunderstood the Critique of Pure Reason based on negative reviews, he published an updated version in 1787. Then in 1788, he publishes the Critique of Practical Reason. So the Critique of Pure Reason is just concerned with what are the limits of pure reason itself. So what actually can we know absolutely without any empirical knowledge. The Critique of Practical Reason concerns kind of almost the conditions for ethics, practical wisdom, practical judgment, things like that. The Critique of Judgment, published in 1790, largely concerns things related to aesthetics, so value, stuff like that. So the point of the first critique is to solve the central problem of the nature of mental representation. So how is it that the mind is able to have a representation of objects in the external world? How is it that in the mind we can have ideas that are meant to relate to correspond to the world itself? Now, we had in rationalism says, well, necessary ideas are innate. Those ideas that are true, that correspond to the world exactly as it is. Not, those ideas that are probably true, but they're necessarily true. They correspond exactly to how the world actually is. Rationalism, of course, argues, well, this can be known by conceptual analysis alone, thinking about the concepts which our ideas are based on. The problem with rationalism, though, is the fact that, well, how can we actually be guaranteed that a priori, so prior to any knowledge about the external world, that such ideas refer to anything in the world? And how especially can we know that without, so to speak, pulling God out of a hat, without referencing God and saying, well, God ensures that, our mind works correctly, or God ensures, the world works correctly, or whatever else, right? Because then we're still just appealing to a kind of another metaphysical a priori idea, that being God. And so, we might fall into the trap of circular reasoning. On the other hand, with empiricism, right? Empiricism says, well, ideas, especially then in this case, really representations, are acquired via experience. So, think of Locke or Hume. We have an idea of, I don't know, that glass holds water because we've seen many different things about glass. We understand the material. We've seen kind of cup-shaped things. We've kind of seen and experienced water, and so we can have this idea that this is a glass that holds water, a kind of representation that's not just in my head, but actually it comes because I came to learn about this thing in a sense passively, right? I have these sensations of the glass into my head, which then gives me knowledge that this is glass. The question for empiricism, though, is how can inductive knowledge give us necessary knowledge, right? This is the problem of induction that Hume, an empiricist, points out. Now, Hume, of course, just bites the bullet and says, well, we never can actually have necessary knowledge. We never can know for sure that our ideas derived from experience actually correspond to the world as it actually is. Hume bites the bullet and says, well, at best we can say it's probably true. It's so extremely likely true we're justified in believing that it corresponds to the external world. But we don't have certainty. We don't have this, it's not a necessary idea. And then also, furthermore, the problem is, how do you explain math? Because math isn't learned by experience. We don't see numbers in the world and learn how math works. So Kant's starting question for the first critique then is, how do a priori, so how do representations, how do ideas, which are not based on experience, refer to empirical objects? So how can we know that if we have an idea that is not, we don't observe it in the world, that it actually still is, in a sense, objective and not just, a fantasy? So is concepts or ideas like space, time, substance, or think of essence, God, cause, and soul, are these things like unicorn, or are they like apple? That's Kant's question. And what he's going to do, why it's called a first critique, by critique it's not a criticism, it's in another sense, another word would be like on the limits of pure reason, right? So what is the scope of pure reason? That which reason itself has full knowledge of and is concerned with, so determines how we even have knowledge in the first place, such that then we can know for sure all the other kinds of knowledge that are dependent on empirical observation. So he wants to know, right? What are the limits? What is the scope of pure reason itself? And then from there, we can determine, okay, all these other things we know based on empirical observation alone and not because of pure reason. And ultimately, he's going to say, well, based on what we know about pure reason, we can say that kind of serves as the conditions for the possibility of all those other kinds of knowledge dependent on empirical observation, the things that like the sciences do, for example. So Kant's philosophy is known as transcendental idealism. Transcendental in that it's about the conditions for the possibility of knowledge, and then idealism in that it's concerned with the mind dependent. Now, Kant says what he has done here has undertaken a Copernican revolution. So Copernicus definitively establishes that actually, all the stars, all the well, not all the stars, I guess, right, but the sun and all the planets, right? These things don't revolve around the Earth, but instead the Earth revolves around the sun, and all those other planets revolve around the sun. So Copernicus shifts our point of perspective, where we think of the universe no longer outward from the Earth, but outward from the sun. Kant similarly does the same thing. In both rationalism and empiricism, especially empiricism, they think of the object right, as external to the mind. The true object, right, is something external that's not mind-dependent. But Kant reverses that. He says, actually, those objects in the world that we have knowledge of, that I can say, this is a glass holding water, it's actually mind-dependent. This comes from the perspective of the mind, not of the external world that the mind then passively receives the sensations. Our ideas for Kant are not just passively impressed by the external world upon the mind, like, for example, Locke and Hume held. Instead, they are products of mental activity, kind of synthesis governed by mind-inherent rules. Now, of course, Hume has this idea that the mind augments things, and this is how we get from impressions to ideas. But crucially, the idea is that for Hume, we first get the impressions before it has anything to do with the mind, right? The senses come first. But for Kant, those sensations are still actually made sense of as sensations by the mind. So the mind is still actually primary. Now, human knowledge, then, according to Kant, is nothing but mind-dependent sensory appearances, then. He calls this phenomena. So that I know this is, glass holding water, I actually know this in terms of how my experience of the thing is. How my mind makes sense of what is in my hand and that my hand is holding something. But I don't actually know the thing itself. He calls it the thing in itself, the noumena. I can never know the actual essence of the thing, of what it actually exists in the world, independent of my own mind. Similarly, I have these two cats over here kind of fighting with each other. I can know that this is a cat, and I can, have a sense about what the nature of a cat is, but I can never truly know what that is because this cat is nothing more than mere appearance. Now, it's according to Kant, an objective appearance, even though it's mind-dependent, and we'll talk about what that means a bit later. But we can look at a very brief summary of how Kant's argument for this works. So Kant says that object representation has matter and form. So the kind of ideas we have, they have matter and form. So in this sense, take a different cat over here. So Marshmallow here has matter in the sense that, of course, it's the content, the thing I see, the color of her fur, her face, the fact that she doesn't want me to be held right now. I think the microphone is putting her off maybe a bit. By form, though, Kant doesn't mean form in the sense of Aristotle, almost the kind of like shape, like a cookie cutter. By form, Kant really means how the thing makes sense, how it's understood in the mind, the kind of logical structure, the structure of the experience, but not the kind of experience that is identifiable in my experience, which is the eyes on the cat, the fur, and everything else. So that's his first argument, that all kind of these ideas, object representations, things that are supposed to correspond to the world, like the cat, these all have matter and form. Now, his second premise is that matter is given to sensation. So, of course, I know this because I'm seeing the color, I'm touching the cat and the soft fur and everything. But the form, the kind of structure that this sensation occurs in cannot be sensed. Because it's the form that makes possible the sensation. Form, then, the third premise, Kant says, must be constituted by the mind. It must be the case that the way that I experience the cat and all those kinds of sensations is made possible by the mind, and how the mind makes sense of the sensations and interprets it. It structures it so that I can relate to it reliably. His conclusion, therefore, we do not represent objects as they really are, but only know them as the mind constitutes them. So we don't represent objects. It's not that I passively get all the sensations and see the cup as it truly exists in the world, but it's that my mind makes sense of it, and it does so, Kant thinks, reliably, and so we can say, in a sense, that it's still objective even though it's mind-dependent. So it's not a full-on idealism. It's a transcendental idealism. My idea that this is a glass is dependent on the mind, so it's mind dependent, but it's transcendental in that it's mind dependent in making sense of objects of the external world. Okay. We have to understand more clearly the Kantian account of form, right? That's really what this whole argument consists of, because we say, yes, of course, these objects have kind of content, the kinds of sensations, but it's this idea of form that kind of makes possible our understanding of the sensations, and that it's, in a sense, grounds it. That has to be understood more clearly. So for Kant, each representation kind, so the kind of representation I have, for each one, the mind imposes a specific form, a specific way in which it understands it. 3 different ways, and think of it as kind of like 3 different ways the idea passes through. First, the form of intuition. This is space and time. The second one, form of judgment, syntactic patterns described by categories. And third, the form of inferences, which are heuristic guidelines for systematic theory. Now, the intuitions of space and time, for Kant, these are a priori. A priori intuitions of space and time, meaning we never see space, we never experience space externally to the mind, but the mind actually forms the ideas of space and time. So, and if you can think about this in the sense that, okay, I might have this sense of space and that, well, this microphone is further from my face and maybe the glass now is closer to my face, but I don't see space. I just see objects. My mind then interprets the objects in the sense of this being closer, this being further away. But there is no objective space that my mind is experiencing. In the same way with time, I might see that, as the sun sets and then the sun rises the next morning. I have this sense of time of we call them days. But I don't experience a day. I come up with this idea of a day that is related to the events of sunset, sunrise, sunset, sunrise. So that I can make sense of sunset and sunrise is only possible because the mind interprets those individual objects, these singular representations, through the a priori form of intuitions of space and time. So space and time are ideas entirely a priori. They are not dependent on experience. So, for example, I might say, a kind of singular representation might be just a singular red apple in front of me, or the sound, specifically the color of a red apple in front of me, I should say, the sound of a particular car passing me, or the touch of my jacket. Now, the form of judgments, these syntactic patterns described by categories, these are the ways in which, in a sense, those particular or singular representations then are made sense. Now, there are actually 12 of these, and we'll get to these in a moment. So it has to be made sense of through these 12 different categories of how the mind then constructs the, taking into account, for example, the redness of the apple, maybe the feel of the apple, and so on and so forth. So some examples of these judgments would be that no human is a cup of coffee, or dolphins are intelligent. And finally, inferences. These are as I said, the heuristic guidelines for systematic theory, and they allow us then to make propositions about the world. So they're representations of judgments linked by some logical connection. So for example, this proposition that either I will make myself a doblada, a kind of Guatemalan empanada, or Gabby will make it for me. Well, I can't make a doblada, therefore Gabby will make a doblada for me. That is a proposition about a state of affairs in the world. How is that made possible? Well, because the mind has already constructed all the things of a doblada, of Gabby, of making, of me, right? All those things that are components of that argument, that proposition here, are kind of are made understandable by the faculty of the understanding, which possesses the categories, which kind of interprets all those singular objects into a way that I can then go beyond just the singular object of doblada and talk about making a doblada. So, for example, there's this nice cartoon where Kant is playing a game of pool with Hume. Now, it's funny because Hume, right? I mean, what's involved in pool? Causality, right? So you have the cue, you hit the cue ball. This hits another ball, right? And you want to go in certain directions to get certain color of the balls in the pockets. So, of course, Hume talking about the problem of induction. How can you be sure that the way you're going to hit it this time will be the way you think it's going to go? Maybe you're very likely sure, but you can never know for sure. Now, Kant thinks you can. Kant thinks that actually that idea of causality, he says, yes, we don't experience causality in the world. The mind constructs the idea of causality, and it does so because it's how we make sense of the world. So notice first, it's, Kant's turn to hit the ball. He says, I'm thinking in a sense that he's taking into account, okay, I'm making sense of this object that is a ball by understanding it in terms of space and time. Then I take the ball, and we can see the 12 categories here. They're broken up into 4 different subcategories. So of the categories, we have those of quantity, quality, relation, and modality. Now, then we take into account, for example, the unity of the ball, that the ball is white. We take into account the reality of the ball, that if it's struck so, right, it will go a certain direction. We take into account, in terms of relation, the causality of the ball and then the other ball it wants to hit. If you hit it this way, then the black ball will go another way. And then we take into account modality, that of necessity, the idea of, well, every time if I hit the ball exactly this way and it strikes the other ball exactly that way, it will go into the pocket as long as it's aimed and everything, everything else is equal. So we have these 12 categories then, which are how the mind makes sense of all the things in the world. So, what are the kinds of knowledge then that are made possible by this kind of philosophy of mind, this account of how the mind makes sense of objects in the external world? So, Kant says that judgments can either be analytic or synthetic, and then a priori or a posteriori. Now, any kind of knowledge which is a priori just quite simply means that which is prior to experience. Now, we can say some kinds of knowledge are prior to experience in that, well, I built enough houses that I know if I don't put this 2x4 correctly in the wall could collapse. Now, I can know that without the wall actually collapsing, but that's still because of my prior experience as a carpenter. So what Kant means by a priori is that which is not at all informed by experience. For example, the idea of causality, Kant thinks, is not informed by experience. It's a category in the mind alone that then makes sense of the external world. And then that which is a posteriori means, that which is after the fact, that which is known, empirically through observation, experience. Now, what analytic is, an analytic judgment or analytic kind of knowledge, is that which is true by virtue of the meaning of the components. So analytic knowledge is a kind of trivial knowledge, basically. It doesn't tell us anything new about the thing or about the world. There's nothing new added to the concept. For example, a bachelor is an unmarried man. So if I know what a bachelor is, then being told a bachelor is an unmarried man doesn't tell me anything new, because that's exactly what a bachelor is. It's an unmarried man, an unmarried person, an individual who's not with someone else. Same thing, right? The idea of an object, well, contained within the concept of an object is that all objects are extended. So if I say all objects are extended, I'm not telling myself anything new that can't be known just by thinking about what an object is in the first place, right? An object is something that takes up space in the world, so necessarily all objects are extended. But synthetic judgment or synthetic kinds of knowledge are true by virtue of the facts in the world. They are informative kinds of knowledge that teach us about the world. There's always something new that's added to the concept anytime we have any kind of synthetic judgment or synthetic knowledge. For example, that dolphins are intelligent. Now, there's nothing that if we see a dolphin, we say, oh, that's a dolphin. There's nothing that just knowing about a dolphin tells us that it's intelligent. There's nothing about copper itself that tells us it's malleable. There's nothing knowing about Julius Caesar knowing that he was assassinated. And there's nothing knowing about a body knowing that it weighs 100 pounds. These are all kinds of knowledge that advance our understanding of the concept. That this body is 100 pounds, if I didn't know it was 100 pounds, now that I know it's 100 pounds, it might tell me what I can and can't do with that body. Maybe I can't lift it. So we can then combine the analytic, synthetic, a priori, and a posteriori into 4 kinds of knowledge. So in the case of analytic a priori judgments, this is a kind of trivial knowledge that's contained within the concept itself. For example, examples of analytic a priori judgments are a bachelor's and unmarried man, and all objects are extended. Now, second kind of knowledge, analytic a posteriori judgments. So this is knowledge that can technically be verified empirically, but it need not be, because in fact, it's already known just by thinking about the concept itself. It's already known a priori. It's already known by the mind itself. So for Kant, this is a kind of paradoxical, impossible knowledge. An example, though, of an analytic a posteriori judgment would be that a triangle has 3 sides. Now, it's true that I can verify a triangle has 3 sides by looking at a triangle and noting 1, 2, 3 sides. But that can also be known by thinking about what exactly a triangle is, right? What's the definition of a triangle? A third kind of knowledge is synthetic a posteriori judgments. So, right, synthetic, that which can tell us more about the object, tells us something about the world. A posteriori, so it's known through observation of the world. This kind of knowledge, Kant says, is useful, but it is not philosophical. This is the kind of knowledge that empirical sciences produce, right? Maybe archaeologists, biologists, physicists, psychology, sociology, etc., right? So the examples of these are dolphins are intelligent, copper is malleable, Julius Caesar was assassinated, this body weighs 100 pounds. But the key kind of knowledge that concerns Kant's first critique, the critique of pure reason, that kind of knowledge, which actually tells us about the world, but which is known via the mind alone, is synthetic a priori judgments, or synthetic a priori knowledge. Now, examples of these are that 5 plus 7 equals 12. So you might think that why wouldn't, for example, mathematics be a kind of analytic a priori knowledge? But Kant says there's nothing about, for example, the number 12 that tells you that 5 and 7 can make 12. You can think about what the number of 12 is, but you have to know about, in a sense, the rules of mathematics. And those are known by thinking about the numbers and how the numbers can relate. And that tells us things useful about the world. We use math in the world. Now, another one, actually, Kant says, is that unicorns are possible. Now, they don't exist, but the concept of a unicorn, that it is possible to make a unicorn, that's a synthetic a priori judgment. We don't see unicorns in the world, so it's not based on observation. But this idea of, let's say a horse and a horn, that you could maybe breed or attach a horn to a horse, something like that, that is only known through the mind alone, taking those categories and putting them together. Another example, that nothing can be all red and all green at the same time. This is something that is known by the mind alone, by thinking about what it means for something to be all at the same time, what the colors are. And then we can use that in the world. It tells us about objects, maybe if we want to paint something. Another example, the shortest distance between 2 points on a Euclidean plane is a straight line. Another example, suffering is bad. Now this one is a kind of moral truth, that suffering is bad. There's nothing about witnessing suffering in the world, someone in pain, that tells us that it's bad. It's only knowledge of morality, of right and wrong, which is known via the mind alone, according to Kant, that, is based on the groundwork of the metaphysics of morals, a different work. But it's only that which can tell us things about the world, like maybe how we should act in the world and how to identify examples of immoral behavior. But that suffering is bad, that's only known by the mind alone. And finally, another one, just, the principle of non-contradiction. No proposition can be true and false at the same time. Kant says that's not known by observing things in the world. It's known by the mind alone. And that it's known by the mind alone, we can use that to, that knowledge informs us about things in the world. So synthetic a priori judgments are kinds of knowledge that are in the mind and not the external world. And yet, here's the interesting thing. They are objective. They're not subjective. So Kant is saying you have these kinds of knowledge, like 5 plus 7 equals 12, which is mind dependent. It's known by the mind alone. It's only in your head. The same way, honestly, you could think about colors. Colors don't exist in the world. It's the mind makes up colors in its head to make sense of the world around us. And yet we can say it's objective. We can say that something is blue and not red. Could be an objective statement, even though it's in the head. That 5 plus 7 equals 12. That is something objective, Kant says, and not subjective, even though it's all in the head. So for synthetic a priori judgments, this is a kind of knowledge that is interestingly about facts, but it's not proved through other facts in the way that, for example, synthetic a posteriori judgments are. So how can Kant actually prove that we do have synthetic a priori knowledge? Now, for Kant, he thinks we can prove this because the mind actively produces knowledge. It's just the fact that we experience the world, and so the objects of knowledge are, in a sense, mind-dependent. So he says we can know that we have synthetic a priori knowledge because the only way we can understand how we can have knowledge of certain things like causality and so on is that the mind produces it. It makes it possible for us to experience the world. He gives two examples of these. First, in the case of mathematics. He says, look, mathematics is not proven by empirical methods. You can't go outside and observe, 3 sticks and come up with the number 3, because all you're seeing is just stick, 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 It's the mind that comes up with this number of 3. So an example in geometry. All triangles have angles that sum to 180 degrees. For Kant, he says that component angles sum to 180 degrees cannot be known by merely thinking about the concept of triangle alone. It instead involves the idea of sum. It involves the idea of 180 degrees. That goes beyond just, an individual looking at an individual triangle alone or the concept of a triangle. Now, another example, actually 2 from philosophy. So, essential truths that are not passively known. So, every event is caused. That the concept event contains the concept being produced by a cause, Kant says cannot be known by merely the thing about the concept of the event alone. So, I can't know that every event is produced by a cause just by seeing, for example, a driver hitting the brakes and the car coming to a stop, right? I have to, in a sense, kind of extrapolate to beyond that one moment of that one person hitting the brakes and talk about, well, anytime someone hits the brake, the car comes to a stop. Now, I make that judgment that brakes make the car stop. Well, how is that possible? Well, the event is the car stopping, the cause is hitting the brakes. How is that possible? Well, that idea of causality is only known by the mind itself to make sense of the world. And another example, again, coming from Kant's moral philosophy. Lying is always immoral. Now, why is lying always immoral? Again, you'd have to take a look at the groundwork of the metaphysics of morals. But according to Kant, this knowledge that lying is always immoral, he says that it is always wrong to lie no matter what cannot be known by merely thinking about lying itself. You have to think about what are the conditions for the possibility of lying. And anytime you talk about the conditions for the possibility of something, you're talking about transcendentalism. You're talking about the mind, how the mind makes sense of things in the first place. An important question. Why is Kant not an idealist like Berkeley? Kant says all of our knowledge is mind dependent. Well, an idealist like Berkeley says, yeah, all the knowledge, all the things we observe, it's actually all in the mind. There is no external world at all in the head. It's important to understand that Kant is not saying there is nothing in the external world. That he says we can't have knowledge of the noumena, the thing that our phenomena, the experience is based upon, is not to say the external world doesn't exist. It's just to say we don't experience it as that thing is in itself, because we can't make sense of it. Because the only way we can make sense of anything is through the form of intuition of space and time, and then through the faculty of the understanding and the 12 categories, and then through inference. So Kant is saying there is an external world, and our ideas, although they're mind-dependent, they correspond, and if an idea we have is true, it corresponds into the world how it actually is. We just don't actually ever observe the thing how it is. It's the mind that constructs how we make sense of how that thing is in the world. Two interesting questions to think about. First, can we really say that synthetic a priori knowledge is objective, even though it is mind-dependent? Can we really say that, well, if we don't actually ever experience the thing in itself, and it's all just because the mind constructs it, why can we say it's objective? And a related question, well, are the conditions or structures of human experience unchanging, or do they change over time? If they change over time, would that mean how we make sense of things changes, and so our experience of those things changes? Maybe the categories change over time, maybe evolutionarily? If that's the case, what would that mean about, again, saying that we can have objective knowledge of the world? Does that turn Kant into a subjectivist if that's true? I think there's a really important questions to think about with Kant's transcendental idealism.